All right, everybody find your seat if you haven't already. Delighted to see you all. So we've got a few different talks tonight. We're going to have a talk on the Ember boot process, understanding what happens when an Ember app boots up and why it's important for you to understand that and where the hooks are that as a developer you might need to know. Ray Cohen's going to share that with us. We're going to do news around the Ember world that Joe West has been doing the last few months and has been really useful in keeping tabs on this fast-moving project. And then Michael Grisati is with us tonight to talk about testing in Ember and the various approaches that he's tried and what his experience has been with that. If I pull it together, I may do a little show and tell from Yapp, the app that we work on that we recently launched to the public. Let's see, I think that's probably going to cover it. Besides that, is there anybody else here who has a lightning talk or has announcements besides Micah, which I know about? Okay, cool. We may do a little Q&A. We'll do Q&A after each talk and then perhaps a bit at the end if people are interested. And then following that, we're going to go out and drink at a nearby establishment that I need help figuring out where that's going to be, because every place we try to go seems to be closed recently. For the next meetup, we're going to skip December because it's almost December and the holidays are coming up and stuff. We are going to do something in mid-January. I'm looking at the week of January 21st. I need to confirm with Pivotal. Chris Selden, who does a lot of Ember performance work, is going to be out in New York that week. So it'd be great to have him share some of the stuff that he's been thinking about and working on. And I'm always looking for speakers to line up, to sort of line up the next few months. So if you're doing something interesting, and even if it's something that you think is pretty basic, I think we need sort of a nice range of levels of talks for this. And just to get a sense for the folks who are here tonight, how many of you have built an app in Ember? This could be simple. Okay, cool. And how many are interested in possibly building an app in Ember in the future? Okay, great. Well, right. Hopefully, some of you are the same. All right. So anyway, the point is, like, I see a lot of people who join the group who maybe they've been building backbone apps and they want to understand how does Ember compare. Maybe they're trying to make a decision for their company between Ember and Angular, things like that. So introductory talks are really valuable too if you want to just get some experience up in front of the room. I found this is a very friendly crowd. So please do talk to me if you think that you might like to present over the next few months. We're really lucky to be hosted the last, I think it's almost 6 months now, here at Pivotal Labs, which is an awesome space, both just because we can fit us all and they graciously provide the pizza and drinks that we're consuming. But also, I was telling this to Josh Knowles, who runs the Pivotal's New York operation. Pivotal's kind of like a third place for a lot of New York developers. You've got the office, you've got home. It's nice to be able to come someplace where you're comfortable, where you can talk with other people who are facing some of the same challenges, where you get to hang out for a while after the meetup. No one's shuffling you out the door right away. With that, I just want to turn the mic over to Micah, who works here at Pivotal, who has been responsible for doing the video and AV stuff for this meetup and getting that stuff out to the rest of the world who can't be here tonight, and who is also the father of my nephew, my brother-in-law.
Wow, thanks for the great introduction. We host a lot of meetups here at Pivotal, and a lot of people don't really realize what we do. We're a development consultancy. A few of the people in the audience also work here as well. It's a great place to work. It's also a wonderful environment to learn, through meetups, through working here, other things. We're test-driven, we pair, we work with really great clients. So if you're interested, pivotallabs.com/jobs, and if you have startup funding, work for companies looking for development, check us out.
Thanks, Micah. Cool. And with that, I'm going to turn over the stand to Ray Cohen. Ray, you may remember, the long-timers, did an awesome talk here several months back about the view layer. And tonight he's going to talk about the boot process. You want to use this one? Cool. Got set. I'm also thinking about doing another game show to rip off next month or in January. So if anybody has good ideas for what game we should try to do, talk to me at the bar or afterwards. Mike, anything we need to know about this one?
Another secret hold down.
Should we put that in the middle?
Hello? Can you guys hear me? No. Test. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me on the mic or just on my voice? Can you guys hear me over there? Yeah? Okay. Switch this one.
Swap it out, perhaps.
Guys hear me? Can you guys hear me now? All right. All right, that was fun. All right, so I want to reiterate, first of all, thanks Luke for putting this all together, and thank you Pivotal for providing a really warm meetup space for us. So this talk is pretty short, and it just covers booting, which I'm going to define as basically everything that happens up until the router kicks into action. So the ideas in this talk are pretty important. They're not terribly complex, but some of them are a little bit new, so I think it's good to just go over them. So this is pretty much something you probably already know if you've done Ember before. You create your application, and that's going to serve as a namespace where you're going to define all of your classes in general. So you've got your router class. You'll stick right onto your app namespace. Any controller classes you have, most likely any view classes, etc. Now there's also a function called initialize on your application instance. And it used to be the case that you needed to call it yourself. But that's not completely true anymore. Now it will run deferred upon DOM ready for you without you doing anything unless you explicitly prevent that. So you can prevent that with, there's a flag called AutoInit, and if you say AutoInit false, then it will be up to you to call initialize yourself. And there's a couple of reasons you might want to do that. You might want to do that because you have some like deferred loading of your classes, so you're doing something asynchronous that's going to load more classes. The main thing you need to know is that classes that you're defining, controller classes in the router class, need to be in place before initialize gets called. Okay, so what does initialize do when it actually runs? It's going to instantiate your router. It's going to instantiate any controllers that you've set on your namespace. And it's going to advance readiness. So what is readiness? Well, readiness is kind of a newer idea during boot that you can have a number of different asynchronous tasks that you don't want your ready function to get called until they all complete. So you might have to call a couple of different servers for authentication information or other data, and you don't want to actually start your app until you get all that. So it's a pretty simple implementation. It's just there's a counter behind the scenes, and when that counter hits 0, it's going to eventually run ready, your ready function. By the way, ask me questions or cut me off if anything if you have any questions. So app.ready is the code that it's like setup code that you can run just before routing starts. So at this point, just about everything is set up for you that you're going to need to have set up. Your DOM is ready. Any router and controller instances that had to get generated are ready. Any configuration that you did with that you deferred readiness for has all been completed by the time this code runs. So this is like the very last step before your router is going to kick into action. So you may be wondering, like, hey, when did all those instances of the router and when did the instances of controllers get created? Well, during your initialize function call, which either you called explicitly or you just let get run when the DOM is ready, these things called injections get handled. And an injection is a way for code to hook into the initialize process and do things that you want to do in basically every application. So for example, Ember data, if you're using it, put some injections on application. One of them creates an instance of app.store if you've defined app.store. And then if so, another injection will make that available on your controllers. So once you get into your application, you can do controller.store, and that's set up through an injection. Injections also are the things that create controllers. If you're not using Ember data, that's just in all Ember apps and router. So if you want, you can create your own injections if you want to have code that you're using. And if you either just want to clean up your code that runs during configuration, or if you have code that you want to use across multiple projects during the initialize process, you can make your injection. All an injection is a name, a function, and a before or after command that says relative to other injections, when should it run. And the function receives 3 arguments. It gets a variable for the app, one for the router, and then a property variable, which is just a string. And that function gets called once for every property on app. So to illustrate with an example, this is the store injection that gets registered by Ember data. So the function checks the property, and if it's store, it goes and it instantiates store and puts it where it needs to be. So there's a couple injections that look like this, and they're just checking one specific value, and they only run for that one value. But there's a bunch of injections that check property, the prop value, against like a regex. So if the regex matches like some controller with a capital S, right, capital first letter, capital C for controller, you can say like, if that's the name of this property, then go instantiate this controller, put a reference to it on the router with this name, and then do the next injections. So that's really it. Once all these injections run, your ready function runs, and then routing kicks off, and your application is booted. So any questions?
What might be a good example of something I'd want to register an injection for?
A good example of something you'd want to register an injection for. Let's say you have your own like separate state managers that you want to have access to your controllers as well. You could say, you could have your own like you could have your own convention where you have something, capital something state manager classes on your app, and then you could write your own injection that says like, if this regex is matched, then instantiate this my other state manager, and also like make every controller available on it. If anyone has done other injections and would like to share like useful things they've done. Right, so tying controllers together is one other example. Right, all injections will, for every injection that you register, this function gets fired for every property on your application. So if you've put a bunch of classes as properties on your application, it'll see those, and then you check the string property name to say, is this like something I want to deal with right now? And then after all the injections run, you still have some other stuff that happens before ready gets called. All right, thanks guys.
Cool. That was good. Out of curiosity, injections are one of the dustier corners of Ember. Who here has used injections in their app? Anyone? Steph, Mike. Okay. Cool. Joe. Great. And did you use cases besides the ones that we just talked about? Anybody have injection use cases besides those? Mm-hmm. Cool. What do you guys use injections for? Mm-hmm. Right. Cool. Chris Selden, who I mentioned earlier, has a bunch of plans to turbocharge injections and sort of change the way they work. So maybe that might be a good topic for him to cover in January, actually. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe West, who is building an app in Ember and has been keeping us up to date about what's happening in the wild world of Ember.js.
Thanks, Luke. So as Luke said, my name is Joe West, and I'm going to keep you up to date with what is going on in the Ember.js universe. So the last time we got together was October 25th. Some of you were here, some of you weren't. It was a very fun time. Ember 1.0.0-pre2 had just been released, and there was a lot of neat changes in that. I had previously mentioned a blog post that Trek Glowacki had written, which was called Advice on and Instruction in the Use of Ember.js. And he recently posted his notes that he used to create that, which I'll share a link with in a few minutes, where he basically makes like a little miniature RDO, and I thought it was like a really nice, some additional context on both that blog post and some great Ember code. There's also there's a few other interesting links going on. Well, specifically one. But there's a video of Tom and Yehuda presenting at a meetup talking about the router and some changes that are coming to Ember Data that was at Adapar, if I'm saying that correctly, if anybody knows. Adapar? we actually rehearsed that, so that was totally planned. In the past month now, since October 25th-ish, a little bit over a month now, the biggest changes have been in Ember Data, undoubtedly. There's been some neat things that have gone on in Ember proper, but Data has really been where the action is at. And you can tell that because there's been 3 revisions since then. So there was 7, 8, and 9, and basically revisions are how Ember Data, because it's really fast moving, is tracking breaking changes. And so there's a file in Ember Data called breaking changes that lists the revisions. And when you instantiate a store, you tell it this is the revision that I'm using, so it knows what to, so that it basically doesn't break, or doesn't let you break yourself, because it makes you upgrade before it'll work. So the big change, these are all breaking, obviously, because it's called breaking changes. The biggest change in 7 was that basically relationships changed how they were acknowledged. Previously, they were acknowledged in the adapter. There was the adapter called store.didSaveRecord, and that presumed that all attributes and relations were saved, and then would mark them as clean. And if you know anything about Ember data, you know that it sort of keeps track of whether records are dirty or clean, based on whether or not they're persisted or not. And so now the adapter must actually treat the relationships as separate entities, which they acknowledge independently of the records participating in them. And there's 3 different ways that it does that. And you should check out the breaking changes doc for that, because this is going to go on way too long if I go through every single one of these things. I'm actually going to skip that one because that's pretty boring. Revision 8, it makes the data format agnostic. It's really a very simple change, but basically everything was written in a relatively general purpose form in the Ember data adapter. It presumed that initially things kind of assumed that you were using JSON. Some of the naming conventions used that. So in the serialization, things were referred to as to or from JSON, and now those are changed to and from data. So that's a good heads up if you're interested in that. And they're going to probably change again to serialize and materialize. So, which is kind of cool. So now Ember data has per type adapters, which I actually do think is really cool, as opposed to that last thing, which I only thought was kind of cool. Basically, you now can register different adapters on the store given the type of model object that you're using. So you can, if you have like legacy APIs laying around that use one adapter, and then you write some new, much better code, you can create new models and provide them with their own adapter. So that's pretty cool. And you can still register a default adapter on your store if you want to do that sort of thing. But so that exists. There's some refactoring of basically how you configure adapters and how attributes map to and from the objects that are serialized there. That's kind of boring and not breaking. There's initial error handling for the REST adapter, which is kind of cool. So basically, if responses come back with an error from your API, then records will be marked as error. Or become error, which is probably one of my favorite methods of all time. Next up on the big breaking change scheme is Ember Data Revision 9, which is now out in master. And what that basically is the adapter specified record dirtying has changed. Basically, records. This is all related to sort of the relationships improvements that have been going on. Basically, records become dirty. Obviously, if we change an attribute on the record, but what happens if you have a relationship? Previously, what the adapter used to do is it would just assume, it took sort of the lowest common denominator approach and presume that everything was dirty. So all the relationships and everything else would get marked dirty, and this was a sort of bad. This is a bad approach, and it was a little bit naive, and would lead to like pathological behavior. So now several new hooks have been introduced in the adapter that actually allow the store to ask the adapter about the state of things when changes are made, as opposed to previously only happening on commit. And since now they're not happening all at the same time, it's much easier for it to essentially keep track of whether or not relationships should be marked dirty or not. So this is actually something that if you're using the REST adapter, you just get for free. But actually, I'm right about that, right? Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah, you should just get that for free for using the REST if the default include REST adapter. But if you're not, just be aware. So that's pretty cool. And that's it for Ember data. For Ember proper, since this is not a Ember data meetup, maybe it needs its own. Tom Dale has started writing a core concepts guide. This is actually pretty bleeding edge and top secret because it's not published yet. So you guys are like some of the first people to hear about it in public, mostly because I found it trolling through the website repos branches. It's in a doc refactor branch, and I'll post the URL later. But basically, it's starting to like define templates and views and controllers and routing. Just some of the things that some of the words we use for people who haven't used Ember. And it's going to eventually grow to sort of explain how all these things are put together or should be put together in an optimal universe. So watch out for that. It's gonna be hot. there's a breaking change. Ember we removed the deprecated behavior that a view's context would default to the view if there was no context and it couldn't find one. That is now null instead of the view. So just heads up if you're doing stuff like that. The biggest warning on that was that it might break some code samples that are like out there and about in the web, but for the most part, if you're keeping up to date on things, it should be fine. You can now call _super inside of computed properties, which I think is very cool because it means you can put mixins in your mixins. We also rehearsed that. Went a little bit better than Luke's. I'm going to remember that. Stefan's where it's at. There also something that I thought was really cool. It's kind of small, but there's an example of how to render a collection view using different child views in the same collection view, which I think is a really cool feature that you can do in Ember, where basically you sort of like pass in a function that returns the child view depending on what type the actual like underlying data is. And so that's actually code that's inside of the comments, or documentation that's inside of the comments that is presumably pulled out to docs. But you can check that out in collection view. It's pretty cool. I'll also post a link to that. Because once again, I think some of the best documentation lives inside of Ember code. There's now an after render queue for view rendering, which allows scheduling code to run after the render queue has been drained. So this, like a common use case for that would be in an instance where all the children have been rendered that were inside of a collection view. So you now know your list is totally displayed. Also, now external dependencies are loaded via an AMD shim, which is basically wraps the entire Ember package inside of a closure. So we can use it with other AMD solutions and not collide with them if you're interested in those sorts of things. And if you don't know what any of that means, totally don't even worry about it because you can totally build awesome apps without worrying about it. Last but not least, Chris and Eric have been working on, Chris Selden and Eric Brain have been working on some great performance refactors, and the word on the street is that there's up to 20% improvements, which you get for free just by using Ember. So you don't have to change your code or do anything. They're just sweet improvements. And there's many more perf ideas on the horizon. And there's actually a perf weekend scheduled in Seattle for next weekend, so just stay tuned because there's going to be tons of more perfs coming your way for the holidays. Oh, is it? I didn't know that. December 6th. Okay. Well, there you go. So there may be more perfs. There may not be. We don't even know. Let's see. Yeah, everybody's going. You're all coming. I just want to give a quick shout out to Bradley Priest, who puts together a blog post semi-regularly about what's changing, and I often refer to that as a good pointer for some things when I can't keep up. Also Luke for checking out my notes and making sure that I didn't miss anything too glaring. And I made a link because there's a lot of things that I mentioned in this talk that are really handy links that you should go check out. And so I thought, well, instead of just reading them to you, which would be insane, I would make a little site for them that you can all go check out. And by a little site, I mean whatever this is called. A Bitly bundles. Bitly's a New York company. So shout outs to New York companies, but they don't use Ember, so fuck those guys. All right. So these are some of the links that I mentioned, like Trex notes, that Tom and Yehuda speech talk, whatever. This is an explanation of the per type adapter things I thought was cool. This is the top secret Tom Dale doc, and that collection view thing, which is, yeah. So just some cool stuff you can check out, The link's up there, and we'll post that in the meetup.com website at some point. And thank you guys very much. I'm working on a startup with a good friend of mine. We're trying to reinvent email, and we're hiring. So if you guys are interested in that sort of thing, come talk to me. And does anybody have any questions or comments about any things we've talked about? Yeah. So previously, the context in views was set to the view itself if it couldn't find a context, and now it's just null instead of that. it's in line. It's actually like just the end result of that, because that behavior was previously, that was the deprecation. Originally it was like originally if there was no context found, it would just point to the view, but that was confusing. So you shouldn't end up in that case typically, but cool. You're welcome. Thanks, guys.
I'm gonna plug in. So, anybody use Zendesk? Yes, yeah. You guys, have you used the new redesign in the upper right-hand corner? You can click and like try our redesign. Anyway, it's way better, and it's all written in Ember. So, we've been every time I answer customer support, I'm just like, oh, this is awesome. Oops. Okay. So I mentioned that we launched Yapp to the public recently. I want to just do a little show and tell on like one feature that I think is really cool. I had fun doing, and maybe you guys will too. So let me log in. So the first page you saw, that was a Rails app, just a regular Rails view. This is an Ember app. This is cool. Delete that one. That was a test. So some of you may have this app installed on your phone. This is the editor and how you make a Yapp. One of the features that we added fairly recently is our new theme chooser, and we did a partnership with Tiny Prints and their Wedding Paper Divas brand. And one of the cool things about it is that we now have Yapps that match the paper version of their invitations and stuff. So you can be all coordinated. One of the things that we knew we had to do, because a lot of their designs come in multiple colors, is we had to come up with a way to give the user the option to pick these different colors and use them. And so we thought this little swatch kind of approach would be cool. And we really didn't want to cut images for all of those things, but we did want that sort of painterly effect. So we thought maybe we could do some kind of mask thing with CSS, and then we came up with the idea of doing it with SVG. Let's see if we can show what that looks like here. So this is that SVG. It's more complex than it looks like, because this is basically the same path 3 times. And the key thing, so the path is you basically just trace something in Illustrator and export it as SVG. The color right here comes, actually that's not the magic color, that's the border. Here is the color right at the top here. So this comes from data, right? So if we look at the theme model in our app, we've got this swatch color attribute, and so we basically just pump that into a template that's going to render that. Let's see what the handlebars template looks like for that. So we've got our SVG, and down here we just have unbound swatch color. Shoot. So normally in handlebars, in Ember's templating environment, if you do double curly braces, the handlebars sort of quotes, and say a property name, that's going to automatically be bound. And so that means that you're observing the underlying property value, and anytime it changes, your template is also going to change. In this case, we know that the further out from this, we're going to be re-rendering this whole area anytime this would change. And so this is a tiny perf optimization to not set up an observer for this when we know we're going to be re-rendering the whole view anyway. And then using this, it turns out to be pretty simple. Here's we go through each of our variations, and each theme has variations, which are themselves themes. And we can set a selected property if it's selected. And then we just include that template file. And if we look at the themes controller, or variations controller rather, each one of these variations we wrap in a proxy it's an object proxy. So when we ask for the swatch color, it's going to go through to the underlying theme model. When we can also use the swatch width and height, which are bound in that same template. And then we have the selected property also. And the selected property, just if you recall, lets us have this nice sort of rounded rect and slight border on the back. So I think it's pretty cool that you can do this, but one night late during our launch push, we did something that I think is even cooler, and that's what I'm going to want to show you next. So if we have these different color variations, we wanted to cue the user that these were available for some themes and some that they weren't. So if I saw this black pen and ink theme, I could also have a sense that there's other color variations available. And the first attempt at this was just that we were going to have like a little painter's palette, black and white, kind of thing, or monochromatic, I should say. And that was fine, but we said, well, wouldn't it be cool if you could kind of get a sense of like what colors there were? And so we certainly couldn't cut images for those because there's sort of an infinite combination, it's a combinatorial problem. And so we said, well, we got this swatch thing, and we got this SVG thing, and maybe we could fill it with more than one color. And it turns out that you can fill SVG with more than one color. In fact, you can fill it with a URL. It's kind of bizarre. What kind of URL? Well, it's a URL that points to a gradient. So if we look up here in our SVG defs, here's a gradient with that ID that URL was pointing to. And if we expand that, then we've got this SVG gradient definition with these color stops and the percentages along the way where those colors appear. So we thought, like, okay, I think we could work with this. And what we did is for each of those themes, this is the handlebars for each of the sort of rectangles in that theme chooser. Actually, sorry, that's not. This is. We include our gradient swatch view. And our gradient swatch view has a template name, and it's the swatch. And it's got a defs SVG property, which basically builds that SVG snippet that you saw. And it's a property, and again, like Steph's question before about unbound, we didn't bother making it dependent on all the things it's dependent on because we know we're going to be blowing this view away if that ever changes. In our application, there's no way you can change those colors. So, but it's a property, which means that we can bind to it. And so we do some crazy math to, not that crazy, to generate these stop offsets. We have a little overlap, so we get this kind of blended effect between the colors. And then the swatch color property, you remember we had swatch color on the theme, and it was just a solid hex color. Well, now it's the URL pointing to this gradient ID, and we actually used the exact same template that we used on the right to do this. Defs SVG, if it's not defined, that'll just be empty. And swatch color down here, when it's hex, it's the hex color that goes right there. And if it's our gradient style, then we put that URL syntax there. So this was one of the most fun things I've done in a while. And there's no way we would have even attempted to do it, I think, without the Ember, the sort of nice property stuff that we get from Ember. So that's my talk. We're also hiring. So if you're interested in working on stuff like this, the company's Yapp, and come talk to me. Any questions on this before we move on to the next talk? Okay, cool. So, Colin. Nobody wrote that. Yeah, that was exported from Illustrator, and then we substituted the pieces out that we needed to want it to vary. Yeah, one thing that's kind of a bummer about that SVG is that there are ways in SVG to do the shadow, the sort of like edged shadow. What do they call, like embossed? Unfortunately, they didn't really work cross-browser, and so we ended up duplicating that same path, SVG path, 3 times, give it a sort of a grayish thing, or like a blackish thing, a whitish thing, and then the fill in the middle. So this would be a lot cleaner if we only needed to do this, have that path in there once. Cool. So next up is Michael Grissati. Oh, thank you. Next up is a topic that comes up a lot on Stack Overflow and other places, and which, by the way, if you are interested in helping out in the Ember community, there are currently 300 unanswered Stack Overflow questions tagged with Ember.js. Now, there's 1,600 and something answered questions, which is pretty awesome. And only 20 open tickets on the Ember repo, which is great. So, but anyway, the Stack Overflow stuff, you can help even just by saying, yes, this is a good answer or not. I'm a late convert to Stack Overflow, but using it with Ember, I think it's really awesome and a super helpful resource. So I would just encourage you to get involved and help out with that. So with that, I'm going to turn over the podium to a local developer who works on Red Rover HQ, doing revolutionizing education using Ember, and he's going to tell us about testing with that, Michael Grissati. Get plugged in. Also, I think this came up in Ember Jeopardy, but in addition to Zendesk, Desk.com also uses Ember. So kind of have a monopoly on help desk software. But I have to say also, man, the difference in the user experience between the Ember version of Zendesk and the old version is enormous. It's so much more pleasant to work with the Ember stuff. I like talking to users. If you don't have any users to talk to, then you get problems. Ready? There you go.
Cool. Thanks. So testing. I come from Ruby background, and before I got into Ember and JavaScript, I'd gotten kind of converted to the whole idea of doing test-driven development and behavior-driven development and acceptance test-driven development and all that sort of thing. I probably overused Cucumber tests in the past, so I'm happy that I don't see a lot of that in the Ember world, because I think maybe it makes you a little too crazy at trying to write everything in plain English and convert it. We spend a lot of time with that sort of nonsense. I don't know if anybody's from Ruby, but in the JavaScript world, I'm not seeing test-driven development talked about the same way. I don't know if it's a cultural thing or what. I mean, I'm only pretty late to the game with JavaScript. I guess I've been dabbling in it for a really long time, but I've never really considered myself a JavaScript programmer. And maybe in the last 6 months, I think I've touched Ruby, I don't know, maybe once a week for a half hour here or there, and it's all JavaScript or CopyScript or whatever. So what I'm hoping is that the Ember community kind of takes what Ruby was doing and starts using that as it's like, that's the way you build apps. You don't build an app that doesn't have a test. You don't build a 3,000 line piece of code that your business depends on, that if you make one change can accidentally break something you wrote 3 months ago. But that seems to be the default. And at least for us, it was really, really hard to figure out, well, how is it that I actually achieve that in my Ember app? So I have a Rails app with all these tests, and I'm slowly starting to make it so we don't even go to the Rails app anymore. And these tests are useless. So I'm happy because I don't have my old Rails app anymore, but I am sad because I do not have tests. So over the last couple months, I've just been experimenting with anything that I could find to test Ember apps with. I tried Jasmine. Seems okay. It seemed good for, I have a random piece of JavaScript code and I want to test it. Worked great. And I don't know if it's a Jasmine problem or a me problem or a combination of everything, but when I tried to actually use something like Jasmine to actually test an Ember app, what I found is, well, how am I going to stub these things out? And how am I going to test the Ember app in 3 different ways because I can't initialize it 3 times? And you just end up with a lot of stack problems that have nothing to do with your application. So I don't know if I have it all solved, but I'm just going to take you guys through what I've learned so far. And hopefully maybe somebody here can fill in some gaps on the things I haven't figured out yet. So yeah. Wow, that is way too big. So I'll start with a PowerPoint, and then maybe we can get into some code. Okay, so that's me, Mike Grasati at Grasati. So acceptance testing is where I started. Acceptance testing is where I started. How's that? All right. Because like I said, I used to do a lot of Cucumber stuff. So I started out with like Cucumber.js, and let me try bang against my Ember app with that. I think that's okay. Actually, it seemed pretty cool, but I just wanted to learn something new. So I started experimenting with what else is out there. The thing that I like the best is Casper.js. I'm not saying it's like the be-all, end-all solution, but it's pretty cool. So the first thing I did when we first had an Ember app and we had no tests and we were really starting to use it in production is just wrapping that Ember app with some tests that verify that it does what I said it would when I released it. So it doesn't have anything to do with getting in there and testing your models or really exercising the inner workings of your code. It's just busting it open a Phantom.js browser and hitting it with, if you're coming from Ruby, it would be like a capybara test. So you can do things like click link, click this label, fill in this text box, and exercise your app. I did that maybe for about a month. I was pretty into it, and then I kind of lost interest, and I think it's still a pretty good solution. But to be honest, it's not really there. At least for me, I found a lot of issues where just threading in this world is so different than it was in Rubyland that I don't know if it's me getting dizzy or the platform not really supporting the kind of things you want to do in a test environment. But like, you click on a link, if you're doing a capybara test against a server, it's pretty clear when the link is done being clicked, because that's when you get a new page. And so then you can check that page for whatever you're expecting. But when you're talking about an Ember app, you have, one, absolutely no idea when the data that you just pushed to the server is actually going to come back and update your views. And then you don't know if it did update your views or just updated the model, but the view wasn't updated yet, because Ember is so awesome at making you not care about that stuff. But if you're trying to hook into it to verify behavior, it gets really tricky. So I found Casper.js was awesome for really simple things. There's a couple of tricks, like make it so that when you're pushing some change, like updating, say, a to-do list, flip a class or something like that, so you'll know that it's pending and then now it's done. Like the way Ember data has pending and loading states, if you just like put those into the classes of your DOM, then you can hook into that from your acceptance test suite, where you would never want to like maybe tell a user that all the time, but you could at least see whether something came back and then verify whether it's what you expected or not. Otherwise, you're going to have all these like wait 1 second and then check blah, and then your tests just suck. But anyway, that's Casper.js. It's worth a look. I was going to do more on that, but I don't feel like I figured it all out, so I figure like maybe next time we do a get together, I'll get more into it. So what I've kind of settled on is to use Kanacha. I think I'm pronouncing it right. I don't know. For everything else. Like I said, I tried Jasmine. Kanacha is built on Mocha and Chai libraries, which are, Mocha I think is based around, most people are using it for Node stuff. And Kanacha is basically a Rails-based harness around those 2 libraries that make it really easy if you're doing a Rails 3 app to test your JavaScript. Now, most of the stuff that it does is not rocket science. You could do this just from the command line without it. So if you're not doing a Rails app, you could get there. But it just packages so much stuff that where I think the barriers are today for Ember developers is, how do I get from not doing any testing to doing testing? And I don't have 2 days to invest in figuring out the framework in which I will test. With this, you can get to a place where you have a really good test environment in like 10 minutes and just start writing some tests, which I think is the key. So like I said, it's a Mocha Chai test runner for Rails 3 apps. The cool thing about it is that every spec is executed in iframe. I've just learned that that is a recent development. For all I knew, it was like there forever. And it can either run in the browser, or you can run it on the command line, and then it just is wrapping it in a Phantom.js executable. So it's using the Chai assertions library. That seems pretty cool. I haven't spent too much time really kicking the tires on it, but it basically lets you write your tests in either like a BDD style or like a generic assertion style. Mocha is just a framework for running those tests. Seems pretty cool, and it handles things like parallelization and synchronization, which is obviously a big deal when you're testing a JavaScript app. But to be honest, like, I'm not an expert in Mocha, but it seems to work. So for unit testing, the general concept is you want to test these things in isolation. You don't want to load your entire app so that you can see whether this one tiny view thing does what you're supposed to do when you clicked on some button, right? So the core of all this is isolation, and I think that's something we don't talk about a lot, but if you are writing one big file with your entire app in it and loading it every time, it's really, really easy to find all littered throughout your code app.whatever. And if you are writing app.whatever and you're not defining a class and assigning it to app, eventually that's going to really limit what you can do in terms of extending your app, packaging it, and testing it. And it also is kind of a code smell in terms of coupling. And if you're doing that, just try to not. See if you can figure out a way to not do that. Ember's pretty good about giving you access to the things that you would need to get to from the objects that you're working in. So if you're working in a view and you really want access directly to the models, it's a little tricky and weird to do that. And that's a sign that maybe you should not. So if you find that it's really hard to get done what you want done from where you are, probably don't. Or post on Stack Overflow and see if there's something you're missing or somebody can help you. So anyway, unit testing, do stuff in isolation. So I think this is from like the Mocha test site, or I can't remember where I stole it. But basically this is a standard unit test, describe stuff, it should equal stuff, whatever. So in Kanacha, if you run that, this is kind of the output in the browser that you would get. It all turns green if you implement the thing. Easy. And that's where you can be just in a couple minutes after having installed this stuff into your Rails app. Just put a couple gems in. So next thing is TDDing in Ember view. So if you're not doing Casper or something like that, starting with your views is not a bad way to go. You want to go outside in whenever possible, so you don't try and design a ridiculously awesome API that'll never be used, which is where you end up if you start by testing your models and trying to make them awesome. So I want to have some kind of login view, and the two things I care about are it should exist and it should have some kind of user input. And by the way, I stole this from somebody's blog post. I can't remember, but I'll post the link. So if you do this, you got to do some before each and after each stuff because you actually need Ember to be running, and you want it to append it to the DOM. That Ember run thing is pretty important. If you don't put it in there, you can't really be sure that by the time that you're running your asserts that it's actually in the DOM. Ember run is essentially, it's wrapping it in a Ember before and Ember after loop, so that it guarantees that by the time you're out of that run loop, everything Ember would have need to have done to execute what you asked it to do is finished. So you're almost always going to want to use something like that when you're testing something that requires Ember to have done its thing, like bindings or DOM or whatever it is. So if you run that, there's also a command line version. So this is the output you would get if you ran it on the command. So I'm running bundle execute rake Kanacha run, and it runs all my tests, and it tells me that it failed because I did not actually implement anything, which is what you want to do in TDD. So write some tests that are about what you wish you had, then it'll fail. Then write what you actually need to make it pass. So, because I don't feel like writing a template and binding it all together, I just do the template inline, and then it passes. So just do that over and over and over again, and you'll have an awesome, well-tested set of library code for views. Next, I would say about what you would do to unit test models and controllers, but I didn't learn how to do that or make presentation slides. But I think it's pretty much the same pattern. I'm sure there's a little bit of issues around how you would isolate them, and I'll have to figure it out in a little while, and maybe next time I'll talk about it a little. What I got way more into is integration testing. Honestly, because it's a harder problem to solve, and it really was killing me that there wasn't a good solution for it. And I don't think I really have it, but I think it's close. There's a few things that just aren't there yet. So the idea here is that an acceptance test is going to verify that what you told your customer or your boss the app will do actually happens. An integration test is not that. It's to make sure that all the stuff that you wrote that you're really proud of and works great individually when isolated wires together properly. And if it doesn't, you want to know that. So like in an acceptance test, you don't want to necessarily write every single edge case driven from the browser from the end user's point of view. But in an integration test, it's much more feasible that you would do that. So you say, let me get all the edge cases. Let me get the times when, what if I get an API call that doesn't come back in time by the time the view has to update? And you can really get more complicated in a way that acceptance tests, that would just take you forever, and you'd have really slow, boring tests, and you would just not write them. So we kind of do integration tests now. I think that's probably how most of us learn Ember. The way we do it is we write some code in Ember, and we boot it up in the browser, and maybe we put some test data in there, and we either use the nav bar in the browser or app router route in the console to move between different states of our app, and maybe we submit some forms, and then we verify the output either with our eyes or by running some sort of jQuery selector statement. That's an integration test. So the thing about that is it takes forever to do them, and you certainly can't automate them that way. So if you're doing that to make sure that your Ember app is working, if you're successful by actually launching an app that people really want and like and depend on, then you're going to be afraid to change it, because you would have to do this every time for all the things that you did before. And you're never going to do that, so you're going to end up with bugs. Or at least I would. So before I move on to the testing, I found this thing. I don't know who wrote it, but it's really cool. Awesome. Way to go, New York. So I was playing with this, Ember Play. And I think it's kind of like the fastest possible way to go from I have some sort of idea about wanting to write an Ember app to I did. And I thought I'd use that as a starting point for what I was talking about with integration testing. So you can go to Ember Play, load the sample tests or to-dos app, which is this one, and run it. And here it is running to-dos, and you can add things that you want to do. And it shows you what the output in the console would be like over there. And it's kind of like, it reminds me of Heroku when it first came about for Ruby. Like, oh, look, I have a visual editor, and I'm making an app, and it's in the cloud. But, I mean, obviously Heroku isn't doing that anymore, but it's kind of like the same thing. And you can load the console on the side and actually interact with the app, and drive it the same way you would the app that you had written in your dev environment and loaded. So that's pretty cool. Just thought I'd show everybody because it's neat. What I did here was I took kind of the test app that comes preloaded and just brought that back in my local dev environment. We'll get back to that later. And I'll show you what it looks like. God, that looks terrible. Smaller fonts. Yeah, that looks like the one. Okay, so basically I took all those little snippets that were all separated into separate files and just put them in one because it'd be easier to present. So I'm requiring vendor, I'm using Sprockets. You can do this require.js or whatever you want. And it is a basic Ember application. There's not really anything that fancy about it, but I changed around a bunch of stuff with respect to how classes load, or not how classes load, how I reference things, which I'll come back to. But basically it's the same thing as comes kind of pre-bundled, and I think it's a pretty standard use of Ember. So that's all defining the app and the views and everything like that. And what do I want to show next? Wow, that looks terrible too. My font's fucked up. Okay. So this is the command that I use to kick off the Panancha process so that I can hit in my browser. So you can either do serve at the end to do it in your browser or run to do it from the command line. But the browser has all sorts of interesting side benefits. So if you're not doing it from a command line interface or trying to run it in the background while you're testing or while you're coding, I'd really recommend trying this version. So this is every test, not just for the to-dos app, but also the ones that I was showing you guys earlier, the array sum, and giving a login view, whatever. And you can click on it, and it shows you what the test code actually looks like from within your browser, which is nice. And then this little box is the iframe in which your test is running. So when this code is executing, it's executing in the context of that little iframe over there. And when it does, it initializes the app. It does all the things I told it to do, and then verifies that the DOM looks like the DOM is supposed to. The great thing about that is when it runs the next, it is in a different iframe. It doesn't know the other one ran. There's no way you're going to be bleeding from test A to test B, which is really, really important when you're trying to actually have a lot of tests. And by a lot, I mean more than one. So for this app, I mean, I'm sure there's overhead. I think if I was running it from a command line, these tests would probably be running in 5 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds. So 98 milliseconds maybe is a lot, but I mean, it's certainly not ridiculous. And these are such lightweight tests that I think that it's probably skewed. I mean, that 90 milliseconds is going to be a constant. And you know, your tests are eventually going to be taking longer than that if you're doing anything integration testy. Yes, it's quicker than Rails. Most things are quicker than Rails. So, okay. Get to the interesting integration testy stuff. Okay, so here is a basic integration test. I'm requiring vendor, which is Ember.js and all that sort of stuff, and then I'm requiring that to-dos app that I just pulled in. So now it's defined in the global namespace. There's an app dot whatever, but I didn't initialize it. So like we were talking about earlier about app boot, you do not want to auto-initialize your application while you are requiring it, because if you do, then you can't have two of them, and then you can't mess with it before it starts up, like by doing things like maybe add another kind of controller that wasn't in your original but you want in your test as a stub or something, which I'm not really doing a lot of that stuff here, but that's kind of the point, is you need to be able to mess with it before it boots up. So what I do in our real integration test for our actual app is I'll load the app, or I'll load the classes for the app, and then I'll go in and create a bunch of data that is unusual in some way. So I put in a bunch of models that maybe aren't related to the associations they should otherwise be related to, and I see what happens in order to see whether things break in an elegant way or a not elegant way. And you want to do that before your app initializes, because you're not trying to simulate what would happen if someone went to your app and added a bunch of things. You're trying to simulate what would happen if your app was loaded and that was the state of the world when it came online, which are just very, very different things to be trying to test. So describe to-dos. It should run the to-dos, or it should show the to-dos. Ember run is going to initialize my app. I create a new record, and I commit it. So that's stuff I do before my test actually runs. And then to do the actual validation, I'm checking to see if the first item matches what I just put in, and I'm checking to see if there are 3 of them. And the reason it's 3 is because the actual app itself has 2 loaded as a sample set, so I'm adding a 3rd. So when that runs, it should show the to-dos. Oh, so if I click on one of those, it'll open it up just that single test or that pair. And let me see if I can do this in a way where you guys can see. Yeah. Okay. So this iframe, oh man. So sad. I can't even click on it. Oh well. But the basic idea is that's actually a live app. And yeah, I can do it this way. No. There. So it's actually working. So you can basically have, maybe these aren't even integration tests, but think about what you do in console a lot is boot your app up, mess with it. So add a bunch of stuff to your models from the command line, maybe override something if you want to experiment, and then you're like, yay, look, the app does what I thought it would, or whatever. That history of commands that you were running in your console could just be the initialization code in your integration test, and you can get to that same point in the browser that you were getting yourself to manually over and over again in a repeatable way. So you can then, as you change your libraries underneath, you can see what impact that has on the things that you were experimenting with. So if you're doing this kind of development of, I don't have tests and I'm driving from the browser to see if my app is working, this is a really good way to transition to, oh, I guess I was testing the whole time, but now it is actually recorded somewhere and useful to me in an automated fashion. Because nobody is just writing code and then just deploying it and hoping it works. Like, you're obviously trying this stuff. So I want to try and find like ways to get on a path from that to building a library of test code. So I think that's pretty much it. I mean, anybody have any questions about this or stuff that they want me to dig into? Yeah. I've done some experimenting, but I haven't actually gotten, I was trying to get async routing, or a demo of what Luke was doing for the asynchronous router into an integration test. And that was not working, but I think it is more because I don't understand how promises work well enough to actually make it work. I think that it's technically possible. But I don't, has anybody else ever tried to test that?
We've done some specs around promises, and one of the things that I found helps is right with custom insertion. It should be all given to promise, and that's basically attaches it to all.
I mean,
On that note, when you have a promise, when you're testing the perfect thing to replace and give the scenario you want to have to deal with. If you have a promise that in real life, for example, it fails after X amount of seconds, and for some reason that puts your app into a weird state, well, hey, you can just make a promise that behaves the same way. Replace the asynchronous one.
and just make it fail.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. From what I can tell, it seemed like the Mocha library had some pretty good stuff for handling, like wrapping things in synchronous calls and that sort of thing. So if you're looking to do it, like that might be a good place to start. And also if you get it working, like post to the meetup group or something, because I think that's something that, at least for myself, I know we're going to be needing to do a lot, and I'm curious how other people are trying to solve it. Okay. Maybe that's the problem. Yeah. Not at all. I have just heard of them. So, do you think I should? Like. Yeah, I mean, like, when I first started looking into it, I just Googled like crazy and was reading news groups, and I found like 20 or 30 different libraries that had varying levels of goodness for JavaScript testing. I knew Jasmine because that's what I was using back in my Ruby days, because I'm not sure if it's a Pivotal Labs thing or what, but okay. So I knew it from that, but I hadn't really played with any of the other ones. So there's probably a lot of libraries that are really good at one aspect of this testing or another that I haven't had a chance to try. So I don't want to say like this is the be-all end-all solution. It was the fastest path for me to get from nothing to something good. So I'm just curious, like, for those of you who are writing Ember apps and testing, what are you using? Mm-hmm. Jasmine? Cool. Pablo. Cool. I haven't heard that one.
Pavlov is a ESL sits on top of key units that makes it look like Jasmine.
Okay.
So when you get key units runner and basic behavior, which is sort of battle tested rock solid, but key units syntax is horrible in my opinion.
Yeah.
The other thing is we try to do work on Ember data, which you all test are key unit, so it's a little bit less context switch.
Yeah, I tried starting with QUnit because that's what Ember is doing. So I'm like, I guess that's what everybody does in Emberland, but I can't stand the syntax. It's hard to work. It's just hard to get my head around it. What about like packaging apps? Because Sprockets obviously is what I'm using here, but I don't like it. I mean, I like the results I got with it, but there's something seems wrong about it. Like I was saying, like where you end up with kind of app, the fact that you have something called app. Yeah, yes. I'm bundling my assets. What, you know, it doesn't take that. So yeah, I mean, before I found this, and we were doing Casper tests only, we were using Brunch, and that uses required JS to compile everything down, and then we were, basically like wrapping up all nice. I liked that a lot. I don't know that Brunch is really the solution for people who are doing Ember apps. It seemed like it was kind of a pain to get my Ember app kind of plugged into that platform. There's also like Yeoman seems kind of neat, but I don't know, it doesn't exactly do what I wanted, and it seems like a lot of stuff's hard coded in there. The other thing that I was just gonna bring up, because I'm curious what everybody else is doing, is I see on Stack Overflow a lot. People are like, well, I have 2 tests in my integration test, right? And the problem is that when I do the second one, it doesn't work because I can't app initialize twice. And I cheated when I did these tests because I have 2 integration tests, and they're both like describe this, and then it should whatever, and then describe this, it should do something else. But if I put a second it underneath, the whole thing would blow up, right? So I'm cheating based on the fact that it's loading in an iframe, and so my iframe can just load the app twice. Maybe there's some magical solution that I don't know about, but basically if I'm in a single iframe and I have my app, I can't initialize it twice. So I can either just initialize it once and then just hope that the stuff in the test 1 doesn't mess up test 2, which is just ridiculous. Or in this case, I was going to make 2. But it seems to me like whether it's Jasmine or anything else, everybody seems to want some way to reset the app to its original state. And there was, I forget who wrote it, but somebody has a pull request out there for add application reset. And they're going back and forth with Tom a little bit. And the reason that it's not there now is because it's really hard, right? You have all your controllers are getting instantiated when you do initialize. Those controllers have state. That all needs to get unwound. Ember data is going to remember the identity maps of all the things that you have. It's going to remember that when you tried to get record 5, it didn't exist, so it's not going to ask for record 5 ever again. So you're going to have completely different behavior if you are running against an app that had stuff done to it before. And that's going to cause your test to fail in really interesting and confusing ways, which is not what we want. So app reset is like, okay, well, we'll just reset all the controllers and we'll roll back all the injections as if they never happened, and we'll clear out the DOM, and I don't know what else, but it changes every day because Ember's always doing new stuff that you don't know about. And so your tests are going to break when you update Ember because you didn't know that now there's injections, or now injections are used in some new way, or whatever it is. So as far as I can tell, app reset is not available. Nobody's working on making it available. So I don't see a way. The only thing that I am thinking could work, but I couldn't get it working in time for this, probably take me another 2 hours or 3 days, I don't know. I was like, I'll almost be ready. My thinking was that when you're creating an app, it's actually doing 2 things. You're creating an application and you're also creating a namespace. And those 2 things are kind of similar, but they're not really the same thing. So you create a namespace so you have a place to put all of your class definitions, because we don't want to use required JS for whatever reason, and we need something to kind of hook onto. So let's call it app, and we'll put all of our things on it, right? But that's really different than running injections and all that sort of stuff. That's just creating a namespace, so you can put your class definition somewhere. So if you're smart about not ever writing code that runs while your app is loading, which is a very good idea to do, but most of the examples I see out there kind of break it one way or another. So like, don't have app.lowercase store, have app.uppercase store, and have app initialize create the instance of store, which means that anywhere you wrote app.store is not going to work anymore. It's got to be app.router.store, but whatever. If you do that, then you can have an app that you could load that doesn't have any runtime behavior at load, right? So now all you have is a namespace, app. Or call it something else, call it test app, call it my app. If you have that, then there's no reason you shouldn't be able to instantiate it like a separate app and just pull in those class definitions from your main one. So you could have like a test app that is a new Ember application, and then it just loops through the namespace of the other one and copies all the controllers and models and anything in that namespace, kind of like the injector code does. It seems to me if you do that, then you have a complete copy of the original class definitions that is isolated in terms of namespace and should be able to run in parallel and not mess with anything. So I think that could work, but I don't know.
I'm not sure how it would work. I think it is stuff that is like Ember bookkeeping stuff, like the run loop, for example, has keys.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So I just thought, Chris, would it be possible to blow away all the namespaces involved, simply, get rid of Ember, get rid of window.ember, get rid of window.your namespace, programmatically delete the script tag which is included in your app, recreate it?
Well, deleting the script tag should be easy, and app.destroy will kill the app namespace. Problem with that is then you don't have access to the classes that were defined in the first place, so I think you need like a require type thing.
You just replace the script tag with a brand new one, your browser will run that script.
Oh, so you're not saying, yeah, you could.
It also sounds similar to the iTransfer, which
Yeah, it really isn't far off.
seems kind of genius to me.
Yeah, it really is. Thank you, guys.
Also related to running, because we were talking about this, is having two Ember apps running right next to each other. So as you saw, we have a few different pages. We would love to unite them into one. We love the idea of keeping them separate, so it's easy to work on. We don't break other people's stuff. And it doesn't really seem to work so well having two Ember apps right next to each other on the same page. I think this might be related to that problem. If we can solve that one, putting a second version of the same application in the same window would be nice too, right? And for integration tests, it should be, I mean, two actually would be 1,000.
Because I got two of them working on that Ember plaything.
Pivotal gas to go to pivotal.
I guess I can. I give up.
Hopefully they'll, maybe we can get internet at the village courthouse.
Sounds good.
The village courthouse is at 3rd and 11th. Yeah, we're still good at the village courthouse. Hopefully it won't be closed.
Almost.